Okay, I'll make a start. I'm Joel. Thanks for introducing us, Ollie. And it's good to see some familiar faces, some new faces here. We're just going to tell a bit about ourselves, why we believe in the things we believe in, and then I think we'll then open it up to questions afterwards. So I'm Joel. I was raised in Stoke-on-Trent in the Midlands, and the main reason I kind of, after a while, I've grown up in an area where I would see people consistently voting for what I thought was an ideology that made them rely on the government, rely on the services, rely on the people providing services that they still then complained weren't very good. They would always say, things are crap, this is not good, this is bad, but they still vote Labour at every turn without questioning, and then still wonder why the things that they complain about wouldn't change. And I kind of thought, okay, this doesn't seem to make sense 16 years later. So add that into my Nigerian upbringing, the values of hard work, aspiration. It was a no-brainer that I was a conservative, and then I've just been sure in that belief ever since. And so I believe in kind of the things you can see on here. I believe in the free markets because essentially I believe that you, the consumer, should be king. Essentially, I believe that you should be able to dictate those things that you, companies, products that you think will work for you, and it shouldn't be a monopoly. It shouldn't be the case of, well, you know, there's kind of, yeah, monopolies essentially that force you to having things and services that you don't want. I believe in limited government because I actually think that you know best about how to run your own life most of the time. You know best how to spend your own money effectively for you, and so then government taking less of your money is probably the best way to go forward with that. I believe in personal responsibility. I think too often we talk about all the rights and freedoms that we have, but we forget about the responsibilities that come alongside them, whether that's as an individual, to our societies, to our communities as well. And so yeah, I think Turning Point, as Ollie has mentioned, has been platform in some areas. We've seen that with previous student groups, and I just think, well, if you can't have a debate with someone about an issue that you're passionate about, and at the end of the day go home and say, well, we completely disagree, but that's it, there's something wrong with the state of society, and so we're going to keep pushing on to get people to disagree with us, debate us, and hopefully improve the state of debate on our university campuses. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Douglas Carswell, and it's wonderful to be here supporting this initiative. A couple of things about me. First of all, I'm an optimist. I think the world is getting better. I look around the country today, and I think in so many ways it's so much better than it was 20, 30 years ago. I think countries around the world are getting better, and I think they're getting better for a number of reasons. Number one is I think there's more free market and greater freedom. And what we need is even more freedom, free trade, open borders, so that people can exchange goods and ideas and services freely around the world. I'm a great believer in the nation state. I think it's very unfashionable amongst elite opinion formers, particularly in academia these days, to believe in the nation state. But I think it's the nation state that actually allows so much human progress. If you have that combination of free nations living democratically with open economies, you get this enormous outburst of human progress that we're living through. I'm also a great passionate believer in the UK leaving the European Union. I joined the Conservative Party 20-something years ago with Dan Hannan and a number of others, and I did everything I could to campaign to get Britain out of the European Union. I had to change parties along the way to make that happen. I'm now firmly committed to the success of a vote leave government. I've yet to find a party that I agree with about everything, but I think that leaving the European Union is a first essential necessary step for us to rediscover the importance of the nation state, and then once we've left, we should open our economy up, we should open our country up, and we should become part of a much bigger world than we're part of at the moment. I'm an optimist because I think this is going to happen, and even though it's a cold, wet, gloomy autumn evening, I actually think you know, we're going to leave, and it's going to be great.
Hi everyone, I'm Dominique. I'm a student at the University of York, and really for me, I wasn't always interested in politics. I first started getting interested in politics when I was 16, and I didn't really know anything about it. But for me, the catalyst for me was the European Union. Now, I didn't know whether or not I was left or right, but I knew that I believed in leaving the European Union. And then as time went on and I started becoming more informed in politics, I started to see that our society has descended into ultimate madness. And the more I speak about this, and the more I express my opinions on this, the more it's revealed to me how much work is needed to be done. And I think when Turning Point UK actually first began, a lot of people were questioning whether or not there was actually a problem on campuses, whether or not there was actually a crisis of freedom of speech. But we've seen so many examples of this happening, and one of the most recent for me being the fact that I was actually invited onto Channel 4 yesterday to discuss 0 hours contracts. Now, as a side note, I support 0 hours contracts. I think they're an extremely good addition to the economy. And Ken Loach, director, very left-wing, he was on Question Time recently, very against 0 hours contracts, I'm sure as a lot of you know. And I found out that he actually refused to debate me. And this is one of the big examples of the problem with the left. I'm a 20-year-old university student. You know, I'm not really that much of a threat, I think, to someone, an old man like Ken Loach. But he didn't want to debate me. And a lot of people were saying, well, the reason he didn't want to debate you is because the left runs on narratives. And I, quite frankly, do not fit the narrative. I'm young, I'm female, I come from a mixed race background, I'm working class. So could he really sit there and use labels to try and discredit my argument? No, he'd have to use facts. And that's something that the left is in absence of. They're in absence of facts. And that's why Turning Point UK is so important, because we're putting forward conversation and a debate, and that's something that the left is quite frankly allergic to. So it's been hard getting off the ground with on university campuses. I go to the University of York, and there was an article recently labelling Turning Point UK alt-right. Now, I don't know about you, but I know that alt-right is extremely anti-Semitic and racist, and why would I, a black woman, support racist ideology? I just wouldn't, and this just goes to show that they don't debate, they smear. So, and here's another example of the way we're actually treated on campuses. When we actually went to Imperial College, there was a poster that said, you know, the right needs to fuck off. And I don't know if I can swear, but I just did. But really for me, just to finish, the core values that I actually believe in is freedom of speech and promoting the ideals of capitalism and conservative thought and ideology. So, yeah, thank you.
Maybe the wrong picture. Yeah.
I'll get a star.
Can we see the poster?
Yeah, but hold it up. There you go.
It was basically the poster they left. They were like kind of timidly left it outside.
Loving the punctuation or lack of it, actually.
Yeah.
They didn't come into the event. They waited till we started, and then crept up to the door, stuck a few posters on with tweets and things like that. We didn't find them till the end, sadly, so we couldn't engage in any debate. But, you know, we've got the proof there.
Well, good evening, and I should say welcome to all of you, because you are currently in my business premises. As you know, I'm a salmon smoker, and for half my time at least, that's my day job, and I'm a Brexit Party MEP for the rest of my time, so I split my time between politics and oily fish, and there's not much difference between the two, I hasten to say. My smoked salmon career is actually sandwiched between politics, because before I joined it, back in 1991-92, I was a special advisor to Peter Lilly, and obviously now I'm back into politics in the Brexit Party. I was actually drawn into local politics about 15 years ago, well, not quite that long, 10, 12 years ago. Because our previous smokehouse was located 100 metres in that direction on what is now the running track of the Olympic Stadium. And I became the voice of all 350 businesses that were being forced out of the Olympic Park. And one of the things that I learned then is that government, certainly local government, is just totally, well, they were totally dishonest and incompetent. And through my business career running this business, you know, Yes, business is challenging, you know, finding customers, dealing with your suppliers, staff, and so on and so forth. The biggest challenge is always what government throws at you. It's just the regulations. These things just drive you bananas. And every single day, in my view, that is what holds business back. And you know, during the referendum campaign, I was often quoted as, you know, talking about some of the madder regulations that had come from Europe, and one in particular where we had to spend literally tens of thousands of pounds reprinting all our packaging so that a packet of smoked salmon could have an EU warning sign on the back saying contains fish. This is, you know, this is the sort of nonsensical stuff we've had to deal with over the years. So yes, I'm sort of into, you know, anti-regulation. I believe in low taxes too. You know, and I think that part of the problem with our politics today is that you don't have enough people in Parliament, in the political world, in the civil servants that have real life experience. They don't actually understand what drives growth. They have no concept of the private sector, and I think that once we have got Brexit done, which we will do, we need a serious overhaul, both in Parliament and in you know, in civil service too.
Join this one. Right, thanks for everyone for coming. Actually, the last time I was here, was back in 2016 when we had a massive vote leave rally, thanks to Lance and with Boris and everyone. And it was kind of exciting times. We were looking forward to winning the election, the referendum, and actually leaving. 3 years later, I'm thinking we were naive, but it's still coming home. It's just a bit delayed. It's fine. As some of you may already know if you're following my YouTube, my background is Persian. I was born in Iran. I came here with my mum when I was a kid. She was a political refugee. And it was kind of interesting to see the difference between the two systems. I moved to London, grew up in a council estate in Lewisham, and went to a Church of England comprehensive school. It's not good. And I saw that the first shock was actually the standard of education. I was doing like year 10, year 11 maths work in the classroom. And I was getting bored after 5 minutes because I was already done, because I said I did this when I was 8. And that was the first shock, but then I also discovered that everyone was complaining, young people, older people, in the area, in the specifically Labour areas like Lewisham, saying this is the worst country, everyone's dying, and it doesn't really work. Let's try this one's much better. And so I discovered, you know, I don't understand why there was a problem with the mood in the country. And because for me and my mum, we were just embracing the new place and, you know, the great opportunity, the great culture, and everyone else was pessimistic. So I decided to get into politics and to give something back to this great country that gave me and my mum a second chance to have a fresh start, but also to fight back against this pessimism. As Douglas said, we're optimists. You just look at the facts. The world is getting better. People are getting healthier. The standard of living is better. And someone has to actually speak about the good news, but also fight for the freedoms that we are slowly losing, because the West are going slightly backwards again, whether it's on an economic level or social level. We're shooting ourselves in the foot. There are a lot of people in politics that are left-wing and right-wing, so a lot of people could be economically socialist, but socially they could be technically pro-freedom. But then there are some people on the right who are, yeah, I don't want to pay any taxes, I don't want the government telling me what to do with my business, but I want the government to tell other people how to live their lives. Don't drink that milkshake, don't do that. So I decided to as a kind of classical liberal leaning conservative, I decided to start campaigns to fight back, to make sure that give more people power, give more power to the people to decide for themselves, trust them, let them make mistakes. That's how we evolve as humans. We almost went extinct a few times throughout history, but we came back because we had to fight back. So that's the message. Thank you.
We're now going to open it up to the floor for questions, and I've been asked if I could be the sort of, the sort of David Dimbleby character in part. So if anyone wants to put their hand up with a question, I'll put it to one of our panelists.
You can be Fiona.
The gentleman there.
Oh, okay. So I guess my question is around the kind of changing cultural ideas around things like transgenderism and the growth of kind of identity politics. And so I just wanted to get a sense of what the panel's view was on how this impacts on people's freedom of choice and on how that's changing society.
Identity politics and freedom of choice. Dominique, do you want to, I'll ask you and then Joel and then...
Yeah, I think my views on this are kind of known because I was recently labelled a transphobe, and I mean, I'm not scared of transgender people, I'm just concerned about the direction in which our society is going in terms of how we conceptualise gender. And one of the big things that I have a massive, massive issue with, and I cannot stress this enough, is the addition of gender-neutral toilets in our society. And actually, when you look at the statistics, when we look at unisex bathrooms, I mean, you can label this transphobic or whatever, but these are just facts, that the vast majority of sexual assaults occur in unisex facilities. And it's a fact that in schools around the country, where parents aren't even informed about these toilets popping up everywhere, girls particularly are scared to use the bathroom, and that's because of things like period shaming, feeling uncomfortable, particularly for Muslim women as well. A lot of their religion is about modesty, and how uncomfortable must you feel having to share a bathroom with a man that you don't know? This isn't really about transgender people, because if you actually look at the facts again, it's often a lot cheaper to install gender-neutral bathrooms in these facilities, in these institutions, in these buildings. So it's not really about transgender people. And also another fact would be that transgender people do make up a vague percentage of less than 1% of the population. So when you actually think about the actuality of who is going to be frequenting these establishments, it's going to be men. So of course people are going to feel more uncomfortable. And I think also one point that we really have to think about is how this actually impacts women's rights, because women's rights are under attack, and it's often taking on a different form, in the form of people that are actually biologically male telling you that you won't be allowed to speak and you can't say biological realities because that's transphobic. If you actually look, a lot of the time it is women that are being targeted, so it's definitely a conversation that we need to be having, and if people don't start speaking out about this more and more and more, I don't know where we're really going to end up as a society.
Joel, did you want to come in?
Yes, I think Dominique made a very good point, and kind of spreading further from that is this idea that it's always about what's the next group that you're going to use next. So I think civil rights is, I wouldn't say racism is dead in society, but I'd say it tends to be, in my point of view, more weaponized for those people who I think use it as a very good tool to say to black people, well, these people are against you, so therefore you need to vote for us, you need to think this way, and this is the culture that you have to fit in. Then we had the LGBT rights movement, which was very legitimate and valid and delivered so much freedom for LGBT people in this country. But then, well, the LGBT movement as it was. And then, I wouldn't say again that LGBT people have the amount of freedom and equality that they deserve completely, but I'd say it's a darn sight better than it was. But then you find the next movement, so at the moment it's transgenderism. And I'm sure, well, as people always say, oh no, you're kind of hyping things up of they'll use something else. I will be happy to bet in 5 years' time there'll be another movement that's being used, and I think it's essentially a tool. Yeah, essentially, where you can apparently you can identify which race you are apparently, and that's a minor movement. But once this one's done and accepted and forced in, what's the next movement is going to be the thing that defies all logic and sensibility, and what a rational thinking person would say, hang on a second, this is a bit crazy. And I just think it's a very good tool used more by the left. The right has been guilty of it before, but mainly by the left now, because they seem to be running out of ideas, to say to people, well, actually, we can't get you on the facts, we can't get you on the politics, we can't get you on the ideas. We've got Jeremy Corbyn representing us, and that fad is gone. Well, let's just say everyone who disagrees with us is a homophobe, is a transphobe, is a racist, is a bigot, and then that way no one can get out of arguing with us. And I think that's kind of my take on this whole identity politics nonsense that seems to be creeping in every corner. And the Conservative Party, not the party members and not small c Conservatives per se, seem to just be bucking and going along with it rather than giving a kind of strong response saying this is nonsense, frankly, which is what it is.
Going back to obviously the point of cultural wars, identity politics, my view is humans by nature are tribal, and it could change, it could go to different levels throughout a few decades and depending on the time you live in. Considering our generations, actually even our parents' generation, generally speaking in the West, we have stable countries, everything's fine, most people have jobs, and there's no kind of a war crisis or anything like that. But humans, as we said, even though we're the optimists, for some reason, naturally speaking, they crave negativity and they just want to find some bad things. So these different tribes, whether it's based on gender or race or anything else, or just your neighborhood, people just tend to try to find fear. They're like, I'm now afraid. That's why identity politics is getting kind of worse and worse. So they put people in boxes, and then they try to defend it against everyone else. And it doesn't really work because, very short story, but when I first went to uni, a friend of mine took me to a Labour meeting, and the first person came to me and said, "What's your name?" Mahyar. Said, "Where are you from?" I said, "London." It's like, "No, where are you from?" It's like, "Oh, I'm Persian, Iranian." And then it was like, turn around, "Oh, everybody, say hello to our new Persian comrade," or whatever. And by the moment then they met me next time, I was a Tory, and they were like, "Oh, you're a race traitor." Like, it makes no sense. So that's the problem with identity politics.
It was Martin Luther King who very famously said that a society ought to judge people not on the colour of their skin, but on the content of their character. Yep. And I always thought that was something to aspire to. It strikes me as bizarre that the modern left in Britain and America has got itself into a situation where it has more in common with apartheid South Africa of trying to categorise people on the basis of their heritage. That is not what we should be doing in a free society. In a free society, we should treat people as individuals. And that means, I think, recognizing that actually it is incredibly destructive when the left starts categorizing people as their group of voters. That's not what we want in a democracy, and I think it's actually pretty shameful that the British left is now going down this route. It's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary betrayal, I think, of a dream that someone once had. And I hope conservatives, small c and big C, will combat it. Did you want to come in on that?
Well, yeah. I mean, as somebody that believes in freedom and liberty, personal liberty, I believe people should be able to live their lives however they choose. That's fine. But what any libertarian has to recognise is that you have to balance that with how it impinges on the freedoms of other people. And I think that one thing that's lacking nowadays is respect for other people's, the way other people want to live. And I think that a lot of that has come from the onset and onslaught of social media and Twitter, and particularly the anonymity that comes with that has allowed people to start bullying. And I think that's a problem. I don't know how we address it, but I think that is a source of the problem here.
Does anyone else want to come in with a question? Maybe on this topic or another topic? Yep.
So I can kind of see why on Twitter Dominique got labelled as transphobe. Just because there's a minute percentage of transgender people, but it's not right to then just equate them to zero and not trying to accommodate for them. Because if it's a small establishment and they've already got their women's toilets and men's toilets, I probably wouldn't encourage them to try and incorporate like another toilet or change anything. But if it's a large establishment, or even the university we were just at for the last talk, they had gender neutral kind of bathrooms, but they were done so in a way where there were each cubicle, they had their toilet, they had their sink, and the doors were from floor to ceiling. So there are ways around it, and you can't, it's kind of just to add to that point. So there are ways around it, and there are ways to accommodate actual trans people.
There definitely, most certainly are ways to do it, but if you actually look at a lot of the places where they're being installed, they're just not doing that. So, for example, there was a school in Wales that had recently implemented gender-neutral toilets, and, and what they actually did was, they made it actually more difficult for the single-sex toilets to be accessed by putting them further away in the building. So think about if you really need the toilet and you just want to go to the toilet, are you going to feel kind of coaxed and nudged into going into a bathroom that you don't really want to go into instead of having to travel further away in a building to just have to go to the toilet? It's one of those things. And also, Sadiq Khan recently announced that there are going to be gender-neutral toilets in the underground. And just think about that environment in London, especially considering how dangerous London is at the moment and what actually goes on there, how uncomfortable that's going to make people feel. I just personally think that people should be able to have a choice. And my point is that it's not that transgender people shouldn't have a space and be made to feel comfortable, because literally, you know, people might not think I believe me, but I literally don't have a problem with transgender people. However, when they comprise so little of the population, I just don't think that we should be altering our society so much in so many ways.
We're a few hundred meters away from the Olympic Park. So what about sport? Should people who identify as women be allowed to take part in the women's 100-meter race?
No, I think that's very clear. I think kind of the point I can see, and I think maybe it came across wrong, was that because they make up 1% of society, that then they should be ignored. No, but however, you can't then change what the boundaries of the facts that we've grown up with, of the biological facts of nature that we've seen inputted and no one has questioned for hundreds of thousands of years, and suddenly say, without giving society a right to debate this and say, it's this, the Olympics Federation to then suddenly say that they would be happy to do this without the consulting with the rest of the female athletes who we can clearly see, and even their male counterparts saying as well, that we don't agree this is right. I just don't think, you can have the thoughts you want, you can think what you like, you can express what you like, identify as you like. I really don't care, as Dominique said. However, to then change things in society, in toilets, in athletics, in every single facet of life, without stopping and pausing to ask the rest of society, what do we think? Are we ready for this social movement to change? I just think it's too far, too fast. And it might come around in 20 years' time, everyone's comfortable and happy. But for now, I just think you ask the average person in the street, should a biological man compete against biological women and win the cycle? Rachel McKinnon winning the Cyclist World Cup, setting new world records. It's not because she's, I mean, you just kind of, these things just baffle me. They baffle me that people think that this can just be done without asking people, women themselves, for permission for this to take place. That's where, for me, the rub is about this whole situation.
I mean, I used to represent a constituency in Essex for 12 years, and I think of the things that concern people in places like Essex and Clacton, and I think of the obsessions of the modern left in academia, and I think that they're delusional. People wonder why in America the Democrats lost the last presidential race, and then you've got to remember that one of the reasons why they lost is maybe because they were talking about transgender toilets and talking about, in effect, making women use the men's loos, and then they wonder why they were out of touch with Middle America. I mean, of course, if you've got a big institution and you can accommodate people, great, fantastic, but that's a good thing to do if you can, but to make it your number one issue, to make your number one philosophical issue, the denial that people with XX chromosomes and XXY chromosomes are different, well, good luck in Clacton with that. How about the next question? Lady at the back.
Okay, so my question is sort of linked, but slightly taking the discussion to a different direction. So my concern, I think, is something that you mentioned. It's really to do with definitions and so on and so forth. So how do you see society moving in a time where, for example, I think, Dominique, you said something, I don't know what it is that you said, and you were labeled a transphobe. And I think probably in the last couple of years, 2-3 years, I've heard the words misogynist, Nazi, fascist thrown around. And to be honest, either I don't know the definitions, or I think they've kind of become throwaway terms. And so my question to you is, what do you think is the implication, societally speaking, when, for example, it's easy to label someone a misogynist or a fascist or a Nazi, for example, when I would argue the majority of people don't really know the definitions of those words, and as a lead-on points, when people start to then engage based on those definitions, what does that mean? Because essentially you're sort of arguing something which may not be accurate. Just my thoughts.
Lance, what do you think?
Well, I have to agree with you, actually. When you hear David Lammy calling somebody a Nazi because they don't believe in, a customs union, it's ridiculous. My father is a Holocaust survivor. He was a child in Poland. He was taken to a prison camp in Siberia. He saw family of his, shot in the square purely because of his religion, for no other reason. That is Nazism. and you completely devalue it when you just throw around these terms willy-nilly. It completely, it totally devalues it. And, I don't know how we change it, but we have to change that. I think the language and the temperature of the language has changed. And again, I come back to what I said before. I think so much of that is driven by social media. It's interesting. I was at an event, a reception at the House of Commons about 6 months ago, and Rachel Riley was there. She was giving a speech about anti-Semitism. And I was having this discussion with her, and I said, I think one of the big problems is the anonymity in social media. Don't you agree? And she was saying, well, she used to agree with that. And people used to attack her, and there was no real name. It was just a picture of a cat or a cartoon character or whatever. But she said in recent months, people are not afraid to put their actual names there now. It's empowered them. The fact that they've got away with it, they're now putting their actual names. And say, I don't know how we stop it, but it's taking us to, I think, quite a dangerous place.
Did anyone want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would say that in terms of its implications, I think it's often used...
Get closer.
Oh, it's often used as a way to... It's often
an ice cream, lick it.
I don't want to rub it on my face, but it's often used as a way to actually shut down debate, because the worst thing to ever be called really is fascist, racist, transphobe, bigot, this, that, that nobody wants to be called that. So it often is a way just to stop people from talking. This might be controversial, but for me personally, I just think the best way to combat that is just to continue saying what you want to say, how you want to say it, in any way that you want to say it. I mean, recently I was also labelled a fat phobe. That's not even a thing. Imagine thinking that's a thing. But I'm apparently a fat phobe. I didn't care, and some people might have disagreed with the way in which I approached...
Yeah, I'm holding my tummy in now.
Some people might have disagreed with the way I approached that, but you aren't going to shut me down and give me all these labels and try and make me out to be the devil incarnate simply for having an opinion. So the best way to combat it is to rile people up, because once they realise that they can't shut you down and you won't shut up, that's when they'll go away and get on with their lives, basically.
Did anyone else want to add, or should we ask the next question? Chap in the front row.
So I got two questions. The first one, they're both regarding Brexit. The first one is especially for Douglas, knowing Dan Hannan as you do. He's been an advocate, he's obviously an arch Brexiteer, but he's been an advocate of leaving the customs union and leaving the European Union, but staying in the single market. Would this not be a decent compromise at this point? And would that not benefit us both in terms of trade, because we stay in the single market, but then leave the customs union so we can make our own trade deals? And the second point, a lot of Remainers say that mainstream economists and experts think that we're going to have a crash in the rest of it after Brexit. These people not believe in the objective truth, and why they're wrong. I'd also like to hear the Brexit Party's position on the single market question. I already know why. I want to know why.
I'm absolutely certain that Dan doesn't think we should stay in the single market. He's written a book, What Next? And he sets out a very good, well thought through idea. We leave the European Union, we leave the jurisdiction of the European Court, we leave the customs union, and we leave the single market. The reason why you might believe that he thinks otherwise is because the left took a little clip of him talking about access to the single market and cut and pasted that and retweeted that many, many times to imply that he believed something he didn't believe. But trust me on this, he wants us to leave and leave properly. And in a weird way, actually, he was the first person I ever met who said we needed to leave the European Union, even before it was called the European Union, lock, stock and barrel. It's good to see many other people catching up with him. Sorry, your second point?
The second point was a lot of Remainers say that the experts will have a crash in the rest of it, and our economy is in for a downturn after Brexit. Are all these economists wrong? If so, why?
Just to recap, George Osborne and the Treasury issued a forecast that said if we voted to leave, not if we left, but if we voted to leave, unemployment would be up by 500,000 and output would be down. Last time I checked, the number of jobs in this country was at a record high, and not purely because the former Chancellor is now moonlighting as an editor and all sorts of other things. Hundreds of thousands of more jobs have been created, and output is at a record high. I think we can infer from that that actually some economists perhaps have a greater confidence in their ability to know the future than they actually do have. But I think we should treat Project Fear as twaddle. I read an article on the BBC today that said, if we left the European Union, it could endanger wildlife in the Falkland Islands. They really are scraping the bottom of the Project Fear barrel. Dominique, over to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm Dominique now. Fats Dominique. Look, I'm in quite a privileged position because our business has been operating for 115 years. So the first 70 odd years, we weren't actually in the EU or EEC at all. And we've been in it for the last 40. And this was supposed to bring great opportunities. I can't think of one great opportunity it's brought our business. We were perfectly successful beforehand. You know, we got through a couple of world wars and a great crash and so on and so forth. But it didn't bring us opportunities at all. We were doing business in Europe before. We're doing business in Europe now. We were doing business in America before. We're doing business in America now. It's brought cost and regulation, and it's just day after day, you know, you get new things coming along, and it's a little bit here, a little bit there. And, you know, yes, you can, you know, I sometimes listen to that dreadful broadcaster, James O'Brien on LBC, and he plays the game. He plays the game, you know, he says, okay, so tell me a regulation that you don't like. And it's not, there isn't one giant regulation that everybody can say, this is ridiculous. It's the build-up of these petty little things. They really harm businesses. I'll give you a very simple example. You know, a couple of months ago, just by our front shutter, our roller shutter broke. We've been here in this building for 12 years. It breaks every 18 months or so. And we call the company, and they come out, they repair it, they charge us a few £100s. We called them about, you know, when it broke down about a month ago, and they said, oh no, we can't repair it because there's a new EU regulation. We can't use that motor mill. You're going to have a new roller shutter. It's going to cost you £4,000. We said, but it's perfectly fine. We've used it for the last 10 years. It's this sort of stuff. It's just the build-up of all these things. Our smokehouse, you know, 30 years ago, they said you can't have tiled floors because dirt can get in the grout. You've got to have resin floors. And so everybody spent tens of thousands of pounds putting in resin floors. Then they realised that if it chips, water gets underneath and the resin floors come up. Say, oh no, resin floors are no good. You can have tile floors. And they said you can't have wooden work surfaces. You've got to change the plastic. And then a few years later, they realised plastic's no good because it actually holds more dirt than wood. But you can change to stainless steel. The rules keep changing the whole time, and these bureaucrats and politicians just have no idea of what it's like and the cost. And so 92% of businesses in the UK have no dealings with the EU. Why should they have to abide by EU rules and regulations? For the 8% that trade with the EU, fair enough. You know, we're now starting to do business in China. I don't mind abiding by Chinese rules to get my product there. I'm delighted because I've got the business in China. So if we've got to do a few extra things, brilliant, we've won the business. That's great news. But why should everybody else in Britain have to abide by Chinese rules when they have no interest in doing business there? So the single market is a real problem. It's not an opportunity. It's great for multinational businesses that sell all over the world. But the driver of our economy is small businesses. That's where 99% of people are employed.
And actually, that's true because I think one thing to add, because the question was, you know, at this point, something like the single market, is it not a good compromise? That's the whole problem, because the single market, there's this intellectual laziness that's going around. In politics in general, the phrase is going around. They sell you this thing as it's just a trade zone. It's just a hub for countries to trade with each other. But in reality, as Lance said, it controls even businesses that don't even trade with the European Union. And that is a problem. So there's no issue with, especially if you want to trade with the EU, even as a trade deal like Canada. The EU don't play fair. They don't do mutual recognition. They do, you have to abide by our standards. It's fine. We could obviously negotiate and say, fine, that these businesses from London that deal with, you know, France or whatever, that's just the price. Whereas as long as you don't add regulations that randomly apply to small off licenses in London or in Manchester, because that's irrelevant. That's the problem in the single market as opposed to an actual trade zone.
Did you want to?
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that just a point that I don't think anybody's really addressed is the point of reasons why people actually voted to leave. And when you placed that vote in the referendum, the reason why people voted to leave was to take back control and to limit immigration, our sovereignty, and limiting immigration. And what remaining in the customs union and the single market does is it doesn't give us the freedom to be able to do that. So if you actually want to deliver on the referendum result, you can't have this policy of being half in, half out, just because a few economists say that we can't do that, so all of a sudden we have to ignore democracy completely. If you're going to do something, you might as well do it all the way, because it will not benefit our economy in any way, shape or form, remaining shackled to the customs union, remaining shackled to the single market, just because, quite simply, our bureaucrats in the civil service and certain members of our parliament and government are too scared to embark on this journey on their own, quite simply.
There was a hand up in the front row.
Oh, hi, I'm Catherine McBride. I'm an economist for free trade, and not all economists believe that the single market is a good thing. But what amazes me is that almost all people who talk on the airways quite happily say no deal will be a disaster or a catastrophe or calamitous. And now you hear people like Diane Abbott saying, of course everyone knows that no deal will be a disaster. It's gone from someone saying it will be calamitous to now everyone knows that it'll be a disaster. No, they don't. This is not going to be a disaster. As you can hear from my accent, I am an immigrant. I come from Australia. In Australia, we don't have a deal with the EU. We still sell you stuff. The UK dumped us without a deal and without 39 billion in 73, and it was the best thing the UK ever did for us. And I'm a monarchist. I'm quite happy with the UK because we had to find new markets. We had to learn to make new things. It was a really good thing. So how have they controlled us? That's my question. How did they get this narrative going and no one ever kicks back?
Catherine's absolutely right. I mean, I was... And as you were saying that, I was looking at my mobile phone and I thought, hang on, I've got a mobile phone here, designed in California. It would have been assembled in China by Brit. Assembled in China using chips from Japan, and it's full of software from India, and we don't have a trade deal, free trade agreement with any of those countries, and yet a no-deal arrangement manages to produce one of these. So, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. There is this completely false narrative that's entered into the political conversation. Lance, how do you account for this? Why is it proliferated?
Well, America left Britain without withdrawal agreement. Seems to have done pretty well. But,
no extension either.
No extension. Look, I think the thing is, again, this comes back to what I was saying earlier. I just don't think politicians have a clue how the real world works. And, the world has moved on. Yes, 40 years ago, it might have been sensible for us to be in the common market. Transport and communication was very different in those days. If you wanted to export and you were in Britain, the way to do it would you get on a ferry and go across to France and meet a few people there and hopefully learn a bit of French and try and negotiate something. And, shipping stuff across on a ferry, that's how it was done. But nowadays, literally at the press of a button, you can speak to people in Peru and Australia and Alaska and anywhere. In the press of a button, you can do that transaction as well. The world has moved on, and countries and bureaucracies and these huge blocks can't keep pace. And things are moving so fast. And if we think about what's had the biggest impact on our lives in the last 25 years, is it the EU or is it technology? It's technology. It's mobile phones and the internet. That's where the change is happening. And my feeling is that this idea that Europe and Verhofstadt have, that you have to be a big bloc to compete, is completely wrong. They are lumbering giants that take far too long to actually make decisions, and they can't keep pace with change. Much better to be small and nimble, the Singapores of this world, and flexible enough to actually handle the change that's going on.
Catherine, I just wanted to say, I think you made an excellent point, and I think it kind of speaks to a wider issue I think that we've touched on, and why organisations like Turning Point need to exist, is the sense that there are so many people who agree with your point of view but don't get the airtime because the political class, that group there, it's easy to blame them, but once it runs through an idea, the same way we talk about transgenderism, we talked about so many different issues, identity politics, it's so easy if no one challenges this, all we hear, it becomes accepted as dogma and truth, and then it's moved on, and then the next thing happens, and we've all then, no one said anything. I think what we can do is we can blame politicians as much as we like. Actually, it's up to us as people to say, actually, I don't agree with this, I want to hear this, I believe a different point of view, and I'll vote for people who agree with me, and I will campaign myself. I don't need to wait for a big company organisation to start it. I myself will do that thing and speak out myself, as opposed to waiting for what I think has become a very kind of political class that vacillates around a certain orbit, and is very kind of, there's not much difference for me within a lot of them in terms of the values that they hold, which I would say a lot of people in the country would disagree with, and I think if we don't as ourselves speak out, then we just let them carry on getting away with it, frankly.
Just a quick note, as Catherine was saying in terms of the Remain side and the experts, and apparently they know the future, but when you actually ask them, they can't tell you the details. I was in Verona a few days ago at a debate against a panel of Remain academics.
Did you get there?
Yes, and
I
I know we missed you. So we had good dinner, but we were up against Vicky Price, the infamous Vicky Price, and a few others who, during the debate, they kept replying with the usual, but the EU is just about trade, and obviously unity, family, and all that stuff. We're all the same, but it's about trade zones. It's about kind of the economy. But then actually, when you ask them the details, they show their true face, which is collectivism and tribalism. They say, no, well, it's us versus the rest of the world. It's us versus America, us versus China, and they see literally the whole world as enemies. And I understand, obviously, there are certain places you have to be skeptical, especially economically like China, but you can't say literally every continent and every country is basically a rival. And they would do anything to protect their protectionist bloc. It's not a trade zone, it's a protectionist bloc, and that's the problem. And the only way you could get them to say that is to keep asking questions, to get them to justify their position. Otherwise, if you say, oh, trade zone, single market, they'll win. And that's how we lost the vote leave argument on that.
Great. There was another hand there?
My name is Laura Kevehazi, and my question relates to all the young people in the audience. I'm a mother, grandmother, I'm an immigrant, a minority. My question is, how do you guys know what socialism means? There's so much brainwashing on campus, and two of you, I have good friends from Iran and good friends from Nigeria, understand what lack of democracy is. So my point is, my family suffered under Nazis and communists. How can we explain this on a campus? What socialism means? I don't think you guys know. And communism. Can somebody say show one successful socialist nation? I think that we should explain, you guys, everybody, explain this on campuses, because the brainwashing can damage a generation.
Mahyar, do you want to have a go?
Actually, just a quick point. Yeah, so as someone who actually grew up in a socialist country in Iran, so they control every single part of your life. But the problem is we lose the argument because we go out and we can't trust the academia, because it's the job of schools and teachers to do it. Don't trust them, it's not going to happen. But we go out there and we do our own version of Project Fear. We point out the problems and all the murder, starvation, which is true, obviously. But the moment we kind of lose the fact that it's from their perspective, they think they're the good guys. From their perspective, they think every policy that controls your life economically and socially is for the greater good. So you have to kind of, when you debate with them, when you kind of teaching it to other kind of young people, we have to kind of say, before we start, they actually think they're good, but this is why they're wrong. I think we've lost the argument every time we go out there and say, well, communism killed millions, which is true, but then young people, it's basically like Project Fear, from what what Remainers were telling us, oh, we're all going to die. It's true, and we should still say that, but we have to start our arguments by saying that, for the record, these silly economic illiterates, they actually think that they're doing it for a greater reason, but this is the result. Millions of murder.
I think there's a real danger that because we don't, in this country, have a folk memory of socialism. The last socialist government in this country went out in '79. So there's a whole generation who have no concept of what it was like. And so how do we counter this? To make it worse, you've got an academic left that is uniform in its belief that socialism is somehow cuddly and virtuous. And so how do we counter this? I mean, I think one of the ways, and Mahyar and I have tried to do this using social media, is to show people that socialism might promise you paradise, but in countries like Venezuela, it means you end up eating your pets. If you end up with a society where people like Jeremy Corbyn know what's right for you, you end up as a basket case. These are people who can't even organize their own allotments properly, and yet they want to try to decide which businesses should be built and where housing should go. So, I mean, I think there is a job, but I think it's also imperative on people like us to recognize that the system we have in this country, the economic system we have at the moment, is not a properly free market system. It is a crony corporatist system that does more to discredit free market capitalism and more to legitimize socialism than Jeremy Corbyn. So we've got to become critics and advocates for change and critics of the big corporatist racket that is the British economy today.
Freedom.
I see some hands up in the front row. Were you going to explain socialism to us?
I'm going to reply to that and also ask a couple of other questions.
Fire away.
So one reason in the education system that I believe that socialism has become very accepted and things by young people is because I sent you a video, Mahyar, about it, about cultural Marxism, about how I watched this documentary. After the Soviet Union fell, a lot of socialists and communists went over to America, infiltrated the education system, then it changed from what we call classical communism of the Soviet Union into more of it. They warped the idea and turned it into a more of an accepting identity politics type, so that it would be more acceptable to the young people and the more naive people who didn't know about the Soviet Union and things like that.
The modern left has taken the old Marxist idea of class division and intersected, instead of capitalists versus the proletariat, a hierarchy of identity and oppression.
Exactly.
And this is a big problem.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Two things. One, I wanted to ask about the deal from Lance and Mahyar, and also, can I ask one question about
If it's short. Yeah.
Yes. Do you think it was fair for Nigel Farage, for people like in the old UKIP who were like Mr. Nuttall and Diane James and Mr. Wolf, who Mahyar's met, do you think it was fair for Nigel Farage to sort of push them out, ignore them and say, I want to start afresh, I'm going to leave these people and not allow them into the Brexit party?
Anyone want to handle the question about UKIP? Do you know what? I'm going to pass on that. I'm more interested in the internal dynamics of the monster raving loony party, but if anyone else wants to have a go, please.
Funnily enough, I used to be the deputy chair of the Cambridge University Raving Loony Society back in the day, so I could also answer questions about that. I mean, look, I think the thing is that Nigel Farage wanted to make very clear that the Brexit Party was not UKIP Mark II, and I think that was very, really important. So he set about trying to have a clean sweep of people that were there before, start afresh, recruit new people, and that's what he did. And he's brought in people from all sorts of walks of life. And the Brexit Party is very different. I think that most of the people, most of the MEPs that I now engage with in Strasbourg, the vast majority of them wouldn't have wanted to have anything to do with UKIP. Obviously, some of them have come from UKIP. And so I think that was, as part of a PR strategy, and it worked. And certainly the results of the European elections showed that. The Brexit Party did extraordinarily well. And actually what we were finding was that, people were attacking us as the sort of xenophobic, right-wing party, and it just wasn't sticking. And I think that's one of the reasons why we did actually do pretty well. The deal. Who knows where the deal's going? I mean, it's, I can comment on the deal, but I've got no control of the deal. Do I think it's a good deal? I think it's an absolutely dreadful deal, but it might be the only deal we've got. There are risks on both sides. There are risks on both sides. There are risks doing the deal. There are risks not doing. If we don't do the deal, maybe a deal will never be done. So it's a gamble both ways.
I think on the deal we've got to get it over the line. It's not perfect, but there's a real danger that we look back and we think we could have done it, and because we wanted perfection, we end up losing Brexit completely. So let's get it over the line.
Hello, my name is Pablo. I'm Belgian, Bolivian, and I just wanted to make a comment about socialism in South America. Recently, the Bolivian president, I don't know if you know, Evo Morales, became the president again for a fourth term, after disregarding the constitutional amendments he made to only have 2 terms per president. Now, he disregarded a referendum in 2016, which allowed him to become president again. And who sent a message to congratulate him yesterday? Well, guess.
Comrade Corbyn.
Oh, yes, Comrade Corbyn. Well, yes. Anyway, now passing on to Brexit. I was just curious to know whether you have any views about the actual neologism that Brexit is. I think that in some ways, yes, some of us, like me and you, like Patrick Minford, would believe that Brexit is an opportunity to be more competitive, to open up to the world and to get great things from everyone else that is not trying to saccage the world like the EU is, in a way. Now, Brexit, however, is a very, very subjective word. Some people might attribute great things to it, some other people attribute horrible things to it. And what I'm saying is that when we have to combat the Remainers by explaining what Brexit is, we're losing the battle. People are having more opportunities to discredit Brexit because this word, subjective as it is, doesn't mean anything. It's not like the Remainers would have to combat something with the word Bristain. And I think, yes, do you think that using the word Brexit all the time is a bit of a problem to explain what Brexit really means?
I would never have personally used the term Brexit because it's a new thing, it's a word. I can't remember the word Brexit being used during the referendum campaign. It's one of those weird words that came around afterwards, and it's allowed people to misrepresent self-government as being something to be fearful of. I think it's all the more important that we do make it clear that if you have self-government, it doesn't guarantee you're going to govern yourself well. If you have self-government, you may end up with Corbynista loons in charge. Having self-government gives you the opportunity to run your own affairs. The onus is then on you to do it and do it a lot better. We shouldn't, I think, use the language of the anti-Brexit crowd. I think we should talk about leaving. We should talk about honouring the referendum. We should talk about fulfilling what people voted for. Just arguing in favour of Brexit is arguing for a frightening abstraction. You're absolutely right on that.
I'd say, for me, I'd say I'm a little bit more hardline. I think Brexit is very simple in the way it's conceptualised. It's exiting the European Union. The reason why people are trying to cloud what Brexit actually means is because they don't want to leave the European Union. And this is the tactics that Remainers use all of the time. They did it before the referendum and then they did it afterwards, implying that nobody knew what they were voting for and people died, so that means that we should just scrap the referendum entirely. Forgetting that people die all the time, so does that mean that we just stop having elections? Like, it doesn't make sense. But for me, Brexit means exiting the European Union. It's a simple phrase and it's a simple way to represent what the country wants to do. I think that we talk about honouring the referendum result, we talk about delivering our democracy. They don't get it. So the best thing for us to do is to stop trying to adopt our language to accommodate them, because no matter what you do, they're going to try and manipulate it anyway because they don't want to leave the European Union, basically.
And just to quickly add, as Dominic said in terms of simplifying it, actually, as you said, Brexit was quite subjective depending on who you were. There were people voted for different reasons, but actually when you go deep down, they all had the same reason, and obviously we go around and say, democracy, sovereignty. It is actually independence and self-government, but when we throw these words, they don't really mean anything to them. In reality, whether you voted to control immigration or to kind of sign free trade deals, or your small business has some issues, it basically goes back to the concept of who does the paperwork, a building in Brussels or a building in Westminster. That's the whole thing. And it goes back to kind of, it's a very boring topic actually, it's admin, but that is the whole thing. And as Douglas said, it could go right, it could go bad, but it's up to the people.
I'm not sure that people did all have the same desire for Brexit. I think people came at this for all sorts of reasons. My personal reason actually is not the bureaucracy that I joke about, because actually, you know, we gold plate rules here, we enforce them with much more vigour, and we've got to shake all that bureaucracy off once we've left. My reason is because I think that Europe's heading down a very dangerous road. I think this sort of imperialist idea that they have is causing a lot of resentment amongst peoples across Europe and leading to extremism. I think the economics of the euro is an absolute disaster waiting to happen. Well, why? Because you can't have a one-size-fits-all currency for the whole of Europe. It's never going to work. You know, you've got massive youth unemployment across much of Europe. Germany is having a whale of a time, although even they're struggling now. But you know, they pay their contribution every year to give them a 300 billion annual surplus, the biggest surplus on the planet, because they have a currency that's way too cheap for their economy. This thing is a vicious cycle. It can only get worse and worse, and will eventually go pop. So I think the biggest mistake Theresa May made is that she tried to accommodate everybody. And I think that if you go back to that referendum, I don't think it was as binary as, you know, it's sort of made out in the media. I don't think people were saying, you know, we've got to leave or we've got to stay. I reckon probably 80% of the people that voted were probably in that 40 to 60% bracket of, well, they could have gone this, you know, their hearts this way, their heads that way, and they could have been persuaded. And after that referendum, she should have done what President Trump said, do it quickly. Just, you know, there's been a referendum. People in Britain, we're passionate about democracy. We've had the vote. Just take them with me and say, right, that's where you voted. That's what we're doing. But she tried to accommodate the others. She let them wedge the door open, and they wedged it further and further open. And that's why we've got into this dreadful mess 3 years on.
Chap in the front row. Is it okay if I change the topic to education?
Please do.
So, Lance, I heard you mention Singapore. And obviously, post-Brexit, I think the UK could perhaps try and emulate Singapore. But on the education front, Singapore, I think, ranks first in the world for maths proficiency. Now, we're currently ranking about 28th. What do you think we can do with our current education system to improve our standing in the world stage? Do you think something like reintroducing grammar schools would be a reasonable route to that?
I think to some extent we need to actually change the viewpoint of people actually in our schools and the way the kids are being taught. I think we need to go back to some of the traditions, the 3 R's and so on. I think there are many aspects of our education system that need to change. All the way through, you know, right the way through up into your levels, you know, at sort of at college. You know, so much of our education system is about, you know, learning this, that, and the other so you can get a job at the end of it. And the world has moved on. Why not teach people to actually create jobs rather than get jobs? So, you know, there's so many aspects. I'm not, I'm not into that sort of world of academia, but there is so much that change that's needed.
Now, you want to...
It's a quick thing. There are a lot of short-term solutions like grammar schools. Grammar schools were obviously great at the time, but you could bring them back, you know, increase them. But short-term solutions to a bigger problem. I'm more of a radical when it comes to education. The government should not have any role in it in terms of being involved running our education system. And in Iran, the majority of schools, a country that's a mess, generally speaking, economically, politically, and everything, but education-wise, they're pretty good. Is because primarily almost all schools are independent. I know in this country people hate the word private, but independent. And you could, if you have every school here independent, let the teachers and people in charge and the parents have a say in running it. And obviously when it comes to the fees, free market, the fees will come down anyway. And the parents that can't afford it, the government could provide vouchers. And the government, there's always a safety net for everyone, just like any other thing we have with job seekers and everything else. And get the government out and actually let them decide for themselves, because the reason we like a lot of independent schools, the model, or now academies actually, is because they're independent in terms of deciding for themselves. It works.
Mayer's absolutely right. Although we may be I think it's actually 28th, 29th, 30th in the International League of Maths Teaching, it doesn't give an accurate picture. There are actually some schools, both in the private sector and in the state sector, that are very, very good. What we've got to do is to make sure that every school comes up to that standard. The problem is, to be brutally frank about it, too many schools are run for the convenience of those on the school payroll. Too many people in local education authorities don't have the best interests of the children at heart. That needs to change. And I think Mayor's idea of a voucher is the way forward. If you give people the right to claim control of their child's share of the local authority budget, it won't just be rich, posh people in West London who'll be able to send their kids to good schools. Ordinary folk in places like Clacton, places like Stratford, ordinary aspirational parents will suddenly have financial power to get the best for their children. You've only got to go and look at some of those maths tuition classes. I forget the name of it, but they're all over London. Kumon. You see Kumon parents, often of may I say, sort of West African heritage or South Indian heritage. They scrimp and they save to get their children that extra advantage. The Kumon parents of London would understand the value of a voucher. That's what we need to do. You're wearing a Brexit T-shirt, sir.
Where did you
can
get
I
that
ask
from?
how you voted in the referendum?
Where did you get that from?
From you. So I'm born and raised in Portugal, from Lisbon. I moved to England 5 years ago, and I watched the 2016 referendum. And I kind of understand why people in England decided to leave, because if I had a choice in Portugal, we'll leave too. You can go and go to hospitality as to any Spanish, any Portuguese, Greek, Italian. If they have the opportunity, they will leave the European Union too, because it's not easy for us to live in the European Union. It's impossible. That's why I'm working here in England and not there. But my question is it really necessary to leave the European Union with an agreement? Can we just leave and that's it?
We are often told that we have to leave with a deal. I can never remember during the referendum campaign the Remain side saying they were only going to honour the referendum if we agreed to permission from Brussels to leave. We can leave with or without a deal. We don't need anyone's permission to be a free sovereign country. I would prefer there to be a deal simply because I would like to be a good neighbour. But if the deal means that we have to be bound by EU law and we have to negate the effects of leaving, which is what Theresa May tried to do, then I'm sorry, we just need to leave. The real disaster, and I think disaster and Theresa May are words that should be used next to each other, because she was a disaster. She was a catastrophe. She was a catastrophe because, as Lance implied, there was a unifying process to be done after the referendum. And instead of unifying the country, she tried to do the establishment's bidding. She tried to do the Sir Humphrey's bidding. She tried to do the House of Lords bidding to make sure that we didn't actually leave. We left in name only. And that created a vacuum that has radicalized the country. We now see marches in London where people who didn't even know that they had a view on the European Union have convinced themselves that it's going to be the end of the universe if we leave. We now have a situation where moderate leavers, like me, who were happy for a deal, are being drawn towards the argument that we shouldn't do a deal simply because we don't want to satisfy the other side. It's a dangerous culture war, and it's created by an absolute lack of leadership. We don't need a deal. I still want there to be a deal, but boy, if the establishment carries on doing what it's doing and avoids signing up to Boris's deal, these are the people who said Parliament has to sit so we can debate a deal, thinking there wasn't going to be a deal. Boris comes back with a deal, then they say Parliament isn't allowed to debate it. If they don't sign up to Boris's deal, then I think we will end up in February leaving without a deal at all.
So I'm going to tell you one thing. What it means for us as a Portuguese, or my friends from Spain, or my friends from Greek, or from Italy, what it means for us seeing England, one of the biggest countries in Europe, just saying to the European Union, it's enough. It means it's a beacon of light for us. Because we want to live too. But we need someone with some power, with some kind of power in the European Union to show us the way. Because as a small country, 10 million people, we don't have any power against the European Union. But you have we have one of the oldest alliance.
Can I ask you a question?
why can't you persuade your leader to vote against our extension?
Because
Then we'll leave.
No, but in my opinion, you shouldn't have any extension. You shouldn't leave right after the referendum. But you know, I don't have any power. I'm just a single man trying to fight against my family. No, I'm trying to fight against my family.
I wasn't talking about you personally. I mean, it wasn't you, but wasn't directed just at you.
I don't think we can underestimate the power of a single person to change the world for good, definitely. So keep trying harder. But I would say that I've probably, Douglas has already said, moderate leavers are still pushing for a deal. I've probably gone past to the point where I think that however we try, even if Boris manages to get agreement with everyone in Parliament or a majority to get this deal through, I just think that now we've got to the point where to kill this kind of toxic division we have in society, leaving with a deal, I'm basically almost there. I'm saying I think that actually, as you said, it would be a light to so many other countries, but also I just don't think, and this is going to open a can of worms on the panel, is that after Theresa May's deal, to have changed 2 articles and tried to sell it as a new deal, I can't really see how there's a new change in there. And whilst we might disagree on another point, but I just kind of think leaving without a deal is the best way forward for our country.
Did anyone want to add anything to that, or shall we move gracefully on? Gracefully.
You told me that we could leave. You told me that we could. Justin Sharshaw from the Bruges Group. You told me that we could leave without a deal in February. How?
Fundamentally, if there's a majority in the House of Commons, I think there's a 70% chance that tomorrow there will be a motion that goes through for a December election. I think if there is a Boris majority, I'd call it a Boris majority because there are many Conservative MPs that it would pay me to vote for, so I would regard myself as voting for Boris, not for them. But if there's a Boris majority in the Commons, and these guys want to play hardball in the Supreme Court or the House of Lords or anywhere else, then frankly we'll have the clout to just go. The lady in the front row. Please applaud if you feel like.
So Lucy Clapp, I work in a university, but I'm not going to ask an academic question. Is there anybody in the government that knows how to negotiate an international treaty?
Actually, I'm going to be controversial and say yes, there is. When I was an MP, I used to meet lots of British diplomats and people in the Foreign Office, and I always believed that actually they weren't on our side. They were an aptly named Foreign Office. They were on the side of people overseas, not the UK. And I met an exception. He was the ambassador, the British ambassador in Copenhagen, and he was really strange because he sounded Eurosceptic to me. And he's now Boris's chief negotiator. And I actually think Boris has managed to find the one guy in the British diplomatic service who is Eurosceptic and knows how to negotiate. And I think that is why he came back with a deal. It's not perfect, but I think Frost is a vast improvement on the others. He's a vast improvement on Ollie Roberts.
So my fear is that, you know, Parliament took no deal off the table, which really tied, you know, the ability of the government to actually negotiate properly. And so you could argue that the deal isn't as good as it would have been if the hands were untied.
Yeah, this is why we need a new Parliament, and I think we're going to get the chance to get one. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I think what you're alluding to is if we have a majority in the Commons prepared to leave with no deal, why should we settle for what Boris and David Frost have got? Mahyar, over to you.
No, you're right. I mean, the whole point of, and now I understand it took us a while to actually see what the strategy was. But when Boris was, whether you like it or not, the point was he knew that he cannot deliver no-deal Brexit with this Parliament anyway. But since he became Prime Minister, he was saying that, you know, deal, no deal, we're out. But that was part of it. So when he was saying no deal, he was saying it to the EU. And that strategy pushed them to come back to the table. And this is the situation we're in now. So ideally speaking, you're going to need a Conservative majority government the next time to actually sort it out.
I'd say not a Conservative, but a Leave majority, I think, is what I would be backing. And as you said,
coalitions don't work.
It doesn't have to be a coalition, but a Leave majority of Leave MPs who are happy to leave without a deal. And I think, as you said, why would you then settle for something that you see so many flaws and holes in? And as Boris, I will give him credit. I think what some members of probably more extreme leaders have done and failed to do is congratulate Boris Johnson for what everybody said was going to be impossible to do in the time he had. His hands were bound by Theresa May's awful negotiating, and as Douglas said, disaster and Theresa May are words that should be, I think, irrevocably bound together. But now that we see that there are things there and that we don't like many things that are similar that Brexiteers came out and said they didn't like beforehand, if there's a chance, and this is probably me being optimistic, more optimistic than you said you were at the start, if there's a chance we can have a Leave majority after this election, I agree with Douglas is going to happen, why then would we settle to have those things? So I can see where you're kind of going, maybe I'm being too optimistic and, you know, it will just never happen, but I think probably that's what I would be more on, coming down on agreeing with.
Can I add? You know, no deal isn't an end destination. It's you know, it's a halfway house to getting what we hopefully want is some kind of a free trade deal. And whether you get there from the no deal starting point or you get there from the starting point we're at now, you know, there are two different routes that will hopefully get you to the same end destination. I'm not quite as confident as Douglas that there will be an election. You know, I'm hoping there'll be an election because that is the only way we can sort out this negotiation. But, you know, there are a lot of Tory MPs, Labour MPs that are conflicted here. A lot of the Conservative Remain MPs, the last thing they want is an election. They're going to get booted out. The Labour MPs, you know, they're also conflicted. They know that there's no way Jeremy Corbyn is ever going to win an election. So on the one hand, why not get Brexit done and dusted, get it across the line, because it's dividing your party too, gives you a chance to get rid of Corbyn and start afresh. But on the other hand, you know, it can work both ways. You know, none of us know. Hopefully there will be one, but we will find out imminently.
Now the gentleman over here has been very patient.
So, excuse me. So on the assumption that tomorrow night the bill does pass and we do have an election on December the 12th, perhaps the 11th, so, or 9th even, whichever date they decide on. So you're all Brexiteers, as we've determined tonight. So which party then will you be urging people to vote for in order to secure
I'm going to start with Mahyar and work our way along.
As they said in 2017, with a different name, Boris Johnson's candidates instead of Theresa May's candidates. Well, we have to kind of, jokes aside, we have to get behind one team and Leavers, if you want to have a Leave alliance, we already have a Conservative government. You just need to kind of get behind a party. And actually, if you want to influence the party, change the policy, become extreme or become moderate, get into the party and actually change it. And that's the only way we can do that at this point. So, Tory.
Lance, as a Brexit MEP, who should we vote for?
Tory. I'm voting for Jeremy Corbyn because he's the Tories' best weapon. Look, you know, in the Brexit Party, we're hoping that there will be some kind of Leave alliance. And whether that is done at a national level, Boris is obviously, you know, he's not commented. You know, the offer's been there, he's not come back. Of course, it would make him look weak if he said, I need the Brexit Party on my side. But I suspect that, you know, even if there's not some national alliance, at a local level, there will be deals sort of done to work out, you know, the best strategy. Because if we're not doing them, they're certainly going to be done on the Remain side. So, you know, I think that's the way it will flow.
Dominique?
For me, it's kind of weird for me because I went from Tory to Brexit Party back to being a member of the Conservatives again. And that's because the likelihood of no deal for me is virtually impossible. And the fact of the matter is, we've got this deal that Boris Johnson was able to get. Like you said, it is not perfect, but I think if we keep going back and forth with, oh, this bit's not good enough, this bit's not good enough, this bit's not good enough, then we're not going to get Brexit at all. And the main issue with the deal was the backstop and the fact that it essentially separated Northern Ireland from the UK. Yes, Northern Ireland will still be in the EU's regulatory orbit, but it's not anything like the backstop. So for me, I'll be voting for the Conservatives because that's...
Joel.
I'd say if you're being pragmatic, and I think this is probably what drew me to the Brexit Party, is I would say vote Brexit Party where it's going to be beneficial, and vote Tory for a majority where it's good. Overall, we want the majority. I think we don't have to have an official pact, but groups like Leave EU are already working on the software apparently, so check that out, look up there, and then hopefully I just want the majority. I'll personally be voting where I live for the Brexit Party because the Tories are 15,000 below in price in Kemp Town, so there's no point. So I'll give it to the Brexit Party, and also because I support them, but yeah, I would say vote tactically.
I've gone from one party to another in pursuit of getting us out of the European Union, and I'd be the first to say vote for a party other than the Tory party if I thought it helped. But on this occasion, I think it's absolutely imperative that bearing in mind there are a few tactical exceptions here and there, but generally speaking, the default for people who want to leave the European Union should be vote for Boris. There's one slight test for me. Vote for Boris because he's the first Tory leader, first Prime Minister in my political lifetime who actually wants out and is in a position to do it. And he deserves and needs every vote he can get. If he is going to go wobbly, it will be because he lets phony Phil Hammond back in the fold. So long as phony Phil Hammond is not allowed to stand as a Tory candidate, not only does Boris mean business, but I think it means that the Tory party has fundamentally changed. After a 40-year mistake of being pro-EU integration, having phony Phil Hammond as the dead canary at the bottom of the cage means that the Tory party has renounced and rejected his historic and catastrophic mistake, and we can draw a line under it. So, you know, I would vote for Boris unless he allows phony Phil back in.
Douglas, can I ask you, do you think that Boris should allow the other 20 rebels back into the party?
To be honest, I could say that I think one should take a sympathetic view of people who leave the party, but I think one should only take a sympathetic view of people who leave the party if they're prepared to leave and have a by-election. I think otherwise, actually, you're pretty grubby. If you leave a party on an issue like this, when it was black and white in your manifesto, you break your word, my view is you're out. I think there will be some of those 21 allowed back in. I wouldn't vote for them if they were in my neighbourhood, but just generally, forget politics for a second. If you have the privilege of being a member of the House of Commons and you're elected there and you change parties or leave parties, and you don't think it's right to cause a by-election when you do it, frankly, I think you should leave public life sooner the better. I'm being told we're allowed 2 more questions, so can I ask the panel to be very brief with their answers? The gentleman over there.
I just wanted to speak about maybe you guys' opinion on a constitution that we can bring. One of the main things in 2016, the referendum happened, and one of the things they say now is that, oh, there was never set out how we're going to do this. It's so complex. Another complex thing after if we do get out in February is a constitution. What could that be? Yeah. And could we, because it's like Brexit conservative, could we bond together under that? Because it's the misinformation that comes through the Brexit, so the Labour Party with Marxism and all this stuff. Okay. Having a constitution fights a lot of that because it'll be about free market, it'll be about freedom of speech. What other things, freedom of internet?
The question is, should we have a written constitution? I'll be honest, part of me can understand your point. The rules have been rewritten by people like John Bercow in the Supreme Court because there's no constitution and they've made up the rules and twisted them to suit their own purpose. And part of me thinks, well, if we had a written constitution, that wouldn't happen. But hold on a second. If we had a written constitution, it would entrench the power of Lady Hale and the Supreme Court. It would be written by lawyers, and we would end up in a situation where lawyers and commissioners decided the rules for us. So by all means, we can refine the Constitution, change the rules of the House of Commons, so never again can we have a spivish speaker making up the rules as he goes along to suit him. But let's not have a grand constitution presided over by Lady Hale.
Can we make a constitution that's maybe not a constitution we put in law, but a constitution that embodies us? Because it's about the messaging, moreover. It's about creating platforms where we can actually get our messaging across.
The problem with that is that we're not America, and the American style of politics doesn't work here. And we've tried it with the Supreme Court. Doesn't work. Get rid of it. We have a constitutional monarchy, and the problem is failing now. The system is because we're moving away from it slowly and slowly, and it's basically becoming a republic without actually having a president. That's the problem that we have. I would strengthen the role of the crown, not in a way that the crown would tell us what to do, but how the unwritten constitution was actually working well until now, and then they started adding the Supreme Court and everything else, and actually that's the fear. If you start writing things, I don't trust the establishment to write things. That's the problem.
Yeah. Well, look at an example, the Fixed Term Parliament Act. Look what a disaster that's been.
Don't get Oliver Letwin to write the constitution, for goodness sake.
God save the Queen.
Yeah, I think I'm in the minority here as someone who actually agrees with you. I agreed I initially, ages ago actually, wanted there to be an actual British Bill of Rights that actually enshrined our freedoms into law, because what that does is it means that wherever government comes into play, they can't really breach that or take away those freedoms. I do think Brexit has really revealed a rot, to be honest, at the heart of how our country works. And I do think there definitely does need to be a conversation about there being some kind of written rule, because a lot of the issues with our country, I personally believe, is that a lot of what we do is actually very old-fashioned, and we haven't really adapted to the way the modern world actually works. If we looked at the Supreme Court and actually modelled it in a way that would work, I don't see why we couldn't have a Supreme Court that has the kind of power that they do have in America, because America has a lot of its flaws, but its system does work in a way that's worked and made them, you know, the most powerful country in the world for generations, so they can't be doing that wrong, to be honest.
We've got time for one last question, and the gentleman here.
Good evening. I want to hear from the panel what your opinion is. Most of Parliament and most of the people believe that the deal, whatever deal it is not good. Has anybody considered suing the European Commission of not negotiating in good faith and causing us to try to accept a bad deal? Question number one. Question number two, if we have a free market, how come we can't order cigars from Germany? Nance?
You're an expert
Interesting.
on smoking.
I'm interested on smoking, but smoking fish rather than smoking cigars. Why can't we order cigars from Germany? I didn't know we couldn't, actually. Can you not?
You cannot.
Next time I'm in Brussels, I shall be joining the cigar committee, and we shall chew on that one. Suing the EU, I don't know under what sort of jurisdiction we'd be suing them, but yeah, but it probably goes to the European Court, and you're not going to get a look at it. So I don't think there's much chance. Look, Bill Cash is challenging the decision to extend, which is very interesting at the moment. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but in Article 50 clause, you can either do the withdrawal agreement or you just leave after 2 years. But in that clause, which allows you to leave after 2 years, it says if you can't, if there's unanimous agreement, there can be an extension. What Article 50 doesn't say is that you can extend the extension. So he's built a case around that, and that is sort of going through the courts at the moment, which could mean that Theresa May's second extension was actually invalid, and we're already out. Wouldn't that be wonderful?
Now, I've been told we've got space for one final question. Lady over there. And then we're going to have 5 short, snappy answers.
Okay, hi. I'm quite new to politics myself, but I just want to know, what's the Conservative, opinion on, with Labour, they appeal to the working class, where you guys don't, and they support the working class in terms of providing stuff like the NHS and youth clubs, and Conservatives say, okay, no, you lot need to be independent, you need to work out things for yourself. Even when that man asked about his country and how they could step out of the EU, you're like, oh, speak to your government yourself. But individuals are stronger when they are together. So I don't understand, even last week we spoke about removing that net and it would help fathers support their children, but it's I feel like there needs to be a transition. So what I'm trying to ask is where do you stand on Labour's opportunities they offer to support working class people?
We'll start with Matt.
They don't. That's the whole point. Labour offer dependency, not opportunities. There's a whole difference.
So what does the working class do? You can't just abandon them.
No, the Labour are abandoning them by creating dependency. They make them stay where they are, and that's the whole issue, because they want their vote again. But in reality, what you want to do is, as you said, the individuals are stronger together as tribes. As we said, humans are tribal, unfortunately. That's just how we are. But when each individual is empowered with liberty and with economic freedom, obviously their family and their neighborhood, they'll work together. And that's the whole point. You actually have to empower individual liberty in order to have a stronger community.
Dominique?
Yeah, I actually come from a working class background. I'm the first person out of my whole family to even finish college, never mind actually get into university. And I think the way we tackle this question is about how Conservatives can actually present themselves as a credible alternative to the working class, is to actually look at what Labour says they want to do and what the results actually are. So if you look at employment rates, the best way for someone to work their way up in life and mobilise themselves to be able to be independent and not dependent on the state is with jobs, for example. Labour do not have a good track record when it comes to employment and actually giving people jobs. And when you look at things that Conservatives believe in, such as social mobility and aspiration, Labour wanting everyone to be the same by taking opportunities away is exactly against what working class people should be aspiring to. And if you actually look at the facts, Labour just lately are losing a lot of working class people because they focus on the metropolitan, middle class, liberal elite. That's what their message is right now, and it's actually the Conservatives that are standing up for and appealing to the average working man.
Yeah. The Labour Party certainly likes to think of itself as being on the side of ordinary working people and the working class, but I would take issue with that. When I first got elected to Parliament, it was in a seat that had voted Labour. It was a Labour-held seat. Labour were clearly on a roll there. By the time I left, Labour came third with about 10% of the vote. They've completely lost touch with suburban working class people in this country. Why? I would say because they're obsessing about transgender toilets rather than dealing with things people want them to deal with. The left, we shouldn't as politicians sit here and think, what can we do to help working people? Working people are no different to anyone else. They want the best for themselves and their families, and they need big government to get out the way so they can do that. The problem in this country is not, the problems in this country have come from what the political elite has tried to do. And it's the working class that has saved this country, and it's saved this country 3 times in the past 100 years. It was the working class who saved this country in 1941. The elite, the toffs, the posh people, the people in the Carlton Club wanted to do a deal with Germany. It was the working class who saved this country when they rallied behind Winston Churchill. This country was going to the dogs under socialism in 1979, when every left-wing academic in the country and every posh show thought we should have a prices and incomes policy. It was the working class who came out and put Maggie in number 10, and she never lost an election because of them. And it was the working class who saved this country in June 2016, when the posh elite in this country said we've got to stay as a province of Brussels, and ordinary folks said no. It's this country that has been rescued by its ordinary people, and we owe it to not patronize and condescend them, and not, like the left, regard them as our fiefdom. It's a privilege and an honor to be elected by ordinary people, and what we need to do is to allow them to have the privileges and the freedoms that rich people in London take for granted.